All right, this is the introduction to genetics. We're starting off learning about DNA and genes, and the second half of the genetics topic is all about inheritance. So this is all in biochemistry. It's a good combination of both biology and chemistry. Okay, as always, to begin the topic, we're going to learn some key definitions, and then we'll expand on those as we learn the rest of the topic. So the key learning intention is that DNA is found in the nucleus of nearly all cells, and it controls how our cells function. It's the most amazing molecule, and without it, life couldn't have evolved and nothing living could exist. The keywords you need to be able to define at the early stage are DNA and chromosome, the bases and in the genetic code, protein and protein synthesis, what cell division is, and the difference between haploid and diploid cells. Okay, let's begin with the story of DNA. We've already learnt back in year 8 about cells and how they have organelles within them that have evolved over time to help the cell do what it needs to do and perform all of its functions. But it's all about the DNA, which controls how the cell functions and how all of its organelles work. So DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. And we can think of it as the molecule for life because it contains all the instructions for how the cell actually functions. It's found in the nucleus. So in this cell here, it's that pink sphere. And every one of the nuclei, so the nucleus, in all of our cells contains DNA, and the same DNA that makes you unique. And every organism is the same. And what DNA is, it's a code. You might have heard of the genetic code before. DNA is a whole set of instructions for how your cells function, which ultimately leads to how you function and grow and survive as a human. So the DNA has a different set of instructions for each species and each individual. Here's what DNA looks like as a molecule. It's the classic double helix shape, which you've probably seen before. 2 spirals. It's basically a ladder that's been twisted up to have a double spiral shape. We'll learn more about the structure as we progress through the topic. Okay, chromosomes are the next keyword. So for a chromosome, we begin with a molecule of DNA, and that molecule of DNA coils around and wraps around some proteins like beads on a string. You can imagine some proteins coming in here. And then the DNA molecule coils around those and wraps itself up neatly into this neatly packaged structure called a chromosome. The whole point that the reason why chromosomes evolved is to prevent tangling of the DNA. Because DNA is such a long and thin molecule, it's basically like pieces of string. And if chromosomes hadn't evolved to have that neat, orderly structure, our cell, the nucleus in all of our cells would basically be like a huge bowl of spaghetti or a jumble of pieces of string here. And it's likely that the molecules would tangle up and tie into knots, and the genetic code wouldn't be able to be used to control the cell. So preventing tangling is definitely important. Okay. Now that we've learned about chromosomes, there are 2 different types of cells that can make up your body and every organism's body. They're called haploid and diploid. So they're words to describe a cell. We can see here, this diploid cell on the right, it has 2 copies of each of its chromosomes. So in this species here, there's only 6 chromosomes in the diploid cell, and they're in pairs. Diploid, if you think of the word di means 2, so 2 copies of each chromosome. We can also say 2 sets of each chromosome. And haploid cells are the opposite. They only have one complete set of chromosomes, so one copy of each chromosome. So in this case, for this species, there's only 3 chromosomes in a haploid cell. We also use symbols to represent a haploid cell. So haploid cells, we use the letter N, which is like a variable in maths. And for a diploid cell, we say it has 2N. And N represents the number of chromosomes in the entire genome, which means how many chromosomes are there for the full set of instructions for that species. For this cell, N is 3 for this species, and 2N is 6. So a diploid cell has 6 chromosomes, and a haploid cell has 3. We'll learn the N number for humans in a minute. Importantly, pretty much all of your body, out of the trillions of cells that make up our body, nearly every single one is a diploid cell containing 2 copies of each chromosome. But the only cells in our body that are haploid are the sex cells. So sperm in people who are biologically male and eggs for biological females. Sperm and eggs are also called gametes. So gametes are haploid. All right, here are a couple of human cells. We've arranged the chromosomes neatly. They don't line up like this normally. They do float around more like a bowl of spaghetti. So we have a diploid human cell and a haploid human cell. And if you counted up each chromosome, for humans, you'd find that in the diploid cell, there are 46 chromosomes. So for humans, our 2N number is 46. And for haploid cells, which are only sperm and eggs, we'd say the N number is 23. Each species is different. They have a particular number of chromosomes. Occasionally, some species might have the same number, but they'll have a different set of instructions within their DNA itself. But on the whole, most species have a different number of chromosomes. Our closest relative, chimpanzee, has 44 chromosomes, so quite close to us. And remembering that diploid cells make up the vast majority of our body, so we have 46 chromosomes in the nucleus of most of our cells, and sperm and eggs have 23 chromosomes in their nucleus. The next concept is the genetic code, which we have mentioned briefly. And here's a representation of DNA, and we've zoomed in on one small section. So if you actually look at a DNA molecule with a microscope, it doesn't have letters like this, but these different colored parts of the molecule here, there are only 4 possible different parts that can make up this middle section of the DNA, like the rungs of the ladder. And it's those 4 parts, the order of those 4 parts, that we call the genetic code, because those 4 different parts are arranged in an order, like words in a book, and that's how DNA can actually carry information rather than just being a molecule, like the majority of molecules are. So we call these 4 different parts of the molecule bases, or nitrogenous bases, and the 4 bases in the code for every species that we've discovered is A, T, G, and C. A stands for the base adenine, T is thymine, G is guanine, and C is cytosine. So the order of those 4 letters in your DNA is literally the set of instructions for how your cells survive and how you become a human and how you grow and do all the amazing things that we can do as a human being. All right, the next concept is the idea of proteins. And these are molecules as well. And they are what DNA produces. DNA is the instructions for making proteins. We'll learn a lot more about how that happens throughout this topic. Here's an example of a common protein that's all throughout our bloodstream. Hemoglobin is found in red blood cells and it carries oxygen. Next to it, we've got a tiny water molecule here, which is H2O, 2 hydrogen atoms, which are the white atoms, and 1 oxygen atom. You can see how huge protein molecules are. They're made of hundreds or even thousands of atoms. And that helps them to have a huge, wide range of properties and functions. And that's because protein's job is basically to perform all of the functions in the cell and in our bodies. They carry things like hemoglobin. They build up our body structure like keratin in our hair. They communicate. They store chemicals and so on. Here are a couple of other examples of the types of proteins in our body. Insulin is a messenger protein. It's a hormone and it regulates our blood sugar level. It malfunctions in people who are diabetic. Amylase is a protein in our saliva which digests sugar, and collagen is in our skin and helps keep it firm and springy. So you can think of proteins as the worker molecules, and they do all of the work in the cell, whereas the DNA is the instructions for making those proteins. Protein synthesis is the next key word. To synthesize means to make, and so protein synthesis is the entire process of how cells make their proteins. We can see here, this is a classic simple diagram of a cell, and you might remember all of these organelles, or some of them at least from year 8. So protein synthesis is the process of cells producing all of the proteins that they need, and it occurs in those tiny sphere-like organelles, the tiny little black dots here, which are called ribosomes. They're basically protein factories. That's all they do. And remember, it's the DNA itself that provides the instructions for how to make the proteins. So the DNA is the cookbook, and the proteins are the finished cake at the end. All right, the final concept is the idea of cell division, and it's quite self-explanatory. So division means to divide, and it's the idea where cells are constantly dividing for different purposes. We can see here, this is an electron microscope view of some cells dividing. Another one here. And these final three images show cell division in a sea urchin here. So it begins as one cell, it divides, and cells constantly divide until it finally becomes the final adult sea urchin. So there are a couple of reasons why cells need to divide. Firstly is to grow, like with the sea urchin here. When you begin your life as an embryo and then become a fetus, a baby, a toddler, all the way up to an adult, you need to literally have more cells that make up your body. So cells divide constantly throughout your first 20 years as you're growing. If you get an injury, your skin or your bones or your muscles, whatever you damage, will divide to repair that damage. And then to produce sperm and eggs for reproduction, cells will undergo cell division to produce some sperm and produce eggs. And we can see here one of these sperm is going to fertilize that egg cell. Okay, so those are all of the key words that you need to begin this topic of DNA and genes.